The fluorescent lights in the hospital waiting room buzzed overhead as I stared at my stepmother Patricia, her usually perfect blonde hair now disheveled, her manicured hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't looking at me with that familiar expression of barely concealed disgust. Instead, her eyes held something I'd never seen before: desperation. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking, "the doctors say you're a perfect match. You're the only one who can save me." I felt my stomach drop as the irony hit me like a freight train. The woman who had spent over a decade telling me I wasn't really family, that I didn't belong in her perfect little world, was now begging me to literally give her a piece of my body. My hands clenched into fists as memories flooded back. Every snide comment, every deliberate exclusion, every moment she'd made me feel like an unwanted intruder in my own father's house. The woman who had banned me from family photos was now asking me to undergo major surgery to save her life. I can still remember the exact moment my childhood ended. I was 8 years old, standing in the hallway of our suburban Denver home, clutching my favorite stuffed elephant, when I overheard Patricia on the phone with her sister. "Oh, Sarah's fine, I guess," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "But she's not really mine, you know? David's baggage from his first marriage. I can't wait until she's old enough to go live with her mother full-time." Those words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled backward, accidentally knocking over a vase. Patricia spun around, caught me standing there with tears streaming down my face, and instead of apologizing or trying to comfort me, she simply rolled her eyes and muttered, "Great, now she's eavesdropping too." That night, when my father came home from his business trip, I tried to tell him what had happened, but Patricia had already spun her version of events. "Sarah's been acting out all week," she told him with theatrical concern, making up stories for attention. "I think she might need to see someone." My father, exhausted from travel and already wrapped around Patricia's perfectly manicured finger, had simply patted my head and told me to try to get along better with Patricia. The pattern was established early and ruthlessly maintained throughout my childhood and teenage years. Patricia had a gift for making me feel invisible while simultaneously making sure I knew exactly how unwelcome I was. Family dinners were exercises in subtle torture. She'd serve everyone else their favorite foods while giving me whatever was left, always with a sweet smile and a comment like, "Oh, Sarah's not picky, are you, honey?" When my half-brother Jake was born, the contrast became even more stark. His baby photos lined the hallways while mine mysteriously disappeared from their frames. His artwork covered the refrigerator while mine was relegated to my bedroom wall. Holiday mornings meant watching Jake tear through piles of expensive gifts while I received practical items, new school clothes, a toothbrush, maybe a book from the clearance bin. Patricia would always make a big show of these gifts, exclaiming how thoughtful and useful they were. But the message was clear: Jake was the treasured child, and I was just someone they had to provide for out of legal obligation. School events were perhaps the most painful reminders of my outsider status in Patricia's carefully constructed family narrative. While other kids' stepmothers at least pretended to care, Patricia made her disinterest abundantly clear. She'd show up to Jake's soccer games with homemade signs and team snacks, cheering loudly from the sidelines. But when it came to my school plays or academic awards ceremonies, she'd suddenly develop mysterious headaches or urgent appointments. "I'm sure Sarah understands," she'd tell my father with feigned regret. "These things just aren't as important to me since she's not really my daughter." The other parents began to notice, and I could see the pity in their eyes when they looked at me. Mrs. Henderson, my fifth-grade teacher, once pulled me aside and gently asked if everything was okay at home. I wanted desperately to tell her the truth, but Patricia had already made it clear that any tales about our family life would result in serious consequences, not physical abuse, but the kind of emotional punishment that left deeper scars. High school brought new opportunities for Patricia to demonstrate my second-class status in the family hierarchy. While Jake got a brand new car for his 16th birthday, a shiny red Camaro that Patricia insisted on posting all over social media, I was told I could earn driving privileges by maintaining perfect grades and doing extra chores around the house. Even then, I was only allowed to drive Patricia's old Honda, and only for essential trips like grocery shopping or picking up Jake from his various activities. College planning was another battleground where Patricia's true feelings became impossible to ignore. She spent months researching the best schools for Jake, hiring expensive college consultants, and touring campuses across the country. When I brought up my own college plans, she'd respond with comments like, "Well, community college is perfectly fine for some people, or not everyone is college material, Sarah." My father, increasingly checked out from family dynamics and focused on his demanding career as a corporate lawyer, would nod absently and change the subject whenever I tried to advocate for myself. The final straw came during my senior year when I was accepted to Colorado State University with a partial academic scholarship. I was over the moon. My grades had earned me recognition that Patricia couldn't dismiss or minimize. But when I excitedly shared the news at dinner, Patricia's reaction was swift and cruel. "That's nice, dear," she said without looking up from her phone, "but I hope you understand that we can't help with expenses. Jake's going to need all our financial support for his education." My father mumbled something about budgets and priorities, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. That night, I lay in bed listening to Patricia and my father argue in hushed tones downstairs. I caught fragments of her side of the conversation. "She's not our responsibility once she turns 18, and Jake is our real priority, and most devastatingly, she'll be fine. She's used to taking care of herself." At that moment, I realized that no matter what I accomplished, no matter how hard I tried to earn a place in this family, Patricia would always see me as an outsider who didn't deserve the same love, support, or opportunities as her biological son. College became my escape hatch from Patricia's suffocating world of conditional love and constant reminders of my inadequacy. I threw myself into my studies with a fierce determination that surprised even me, working 2 part-time jobs to cover expenses that other students took for granted. While my classmates complained about cafeteria food, I was grateful for my meal plan because it meant I didn't have to ask Patricia for grocery money during breaks. I majored in business administration with a minor in psychology, the business degree because I was practical about needing to support myself, and psychology because I desperately wanted to understand the dynamics that had shaped my childhood. My professors noticed my work ethic and dedication, and by my junior year, I was earning academic honors that I couldn't wait to share with my father. But when I called home with news of making Dean's List, Patricia answered the phone and her response was predictably dismissive. "Oh, that's nice, Sarah. Your father's at Jake's baseball tournament. You know, the one where he's being scouted by college recruiters. I'll tell him you called." The line went dead before I could even respond, and I realized that no achievement would ever be significant enough to earn genuine recognition in Patricia's hierarchy of importance. The summers between college years were exercises in enduring Patricia's increasingly creative methods of making me feel unwelcome in my own father's house. She'd redecorate my bedroom while I was away, turning it into her craft room and relegating my belongings to boxes in the garage. "I thought you were becoming independent," she'd say with feigned innocence when I protested, and we needed the space for more important things. She'd plan elaborate family vacations during my spring breaks, making sure to post dozens of photos on Facebook of her, my father, and Jake enjoying tropical beaches or ski resorts. When I'd see these posts, she'd call it coincidental timing, but the message was crystal clear: real family memories were made without me. The psychological warfare extended to everyday interactions. She'd cook my father's favorite meals on nights when she knew I'd be joining them for dinner, then act surprised when there wasn't enough food. "Oh, Sarah, I forgot you were coming," she'd say with theatrical shock, "but there's sandwich meat in the fridge." My father would offer to share his plate, but Patricia would quickly redirect his attention to some pressing matter about Jake's upcoming school events or college applications. Jake, now a teenager himself, had absorbed Patricia's attitude toward me through years of subtle and not-so-subtle messaging. While he wasn't actively cruel, his indifference was almost worse because it felt like a betrayal of our early childhood bond. When he was little, Jake used to follow me around the house, wanting to play games and hear bedtime stories. But as Patricia's influence grew stronger and her favoritism became more pronounced, Jake learned that his social status in the family was tied to maintaining distance from me. He stopped inviting me to hang out with his friends, stopped asking for my help with homework, and started treating me like an annoying houseguest rather than his sister. During family gatherings, he'd sit between Patricia and my father, creating a physical barrier that symbolized the emotional one Patricia had constructed. The few times I tried to reconnect with him, Patricia would quickly intervene with activities that required my absence. "Jake, honey, let's go shopping for your new cleats while Sarah does her, whatever it is she does." The casual dismissal of my existence had become so normalized that even Jake didn't question it anymore. My father's complicity in this family dynamic was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of my situation. I could understand Patricia's behavior. She'd never wanted a stepchild, and she'd made that clear from the beginning. But my father's gradual abandonment of his parental responsibilities toward me felt like a deeper betrayal. He'd been a loving, attentive father during my early childhood, before Patricia entered our lives. We'd had Saturday morning pancake traditions, bedtime story rituals, and deep conversations about everything from school problems to my dreams for the future. But as Patricia's influence grew stronger, his attention shifted almost entirely to maintaining peace in his marriage, even if that meant sacrificing his relationship with his firstborn daughter. He'd stopped attending my school events unless Patricia deemed them important enough, stopped asking about my grades or social life, and started treating me more like a roommate than his child. When I'd try to have serious conversations with him about college, career goals, or even just wanting to spend quality time together, he'd get uncomfortable and find reasons to cut the discussion short. "Ask your stepmother" became his default response to almost every request or concern I brought to him, effectively abdicating his parental role and leaving me entirely at Patricia's mercy. The breaking point came during my senior year of college when I was preparing for graduate school applications. I had worked incredibly hard to maintain a 3.8 GPA while juggling multiple jobs, and several professors had encouraged me to apply for competitive MBA programs. I knew the application fees and preparation costs would be substantial, but I hoped that my father might finally recognize my achievements and offer some financial support. When I called to discuss my plans, Patricia answered and immediately launched into a monologue about Jake's recent acceptance to his dream university and all the expenses they'd be facing. "It's really overwhelming," she said with dramatic flair. "The tuition, room and board, plus he'll need spending money and a reliable car. Your father and I are stretched to our absolute limit financially." When I mentioned my own graduate school aspirations, her tone shifted to barely concealed irritation. "Sarah, honey, you're already getting 1 degree, which is more than a lot of people ever achieve. Maybe it's time to start thinking about getting a real job instead of staying in school forever. Jake's education has to be our priority right now. He's got his whole future ahead of him." The implication that my future was somehow less important or valuable than Jake's hit me like a physical blow, but what hurt even more was hearing my father's voice in the background, not protesting or defending me, but actually agreeing with Patricia's assessment. That conversation crystallized something that had been building inside me for years, the recognition that I would never be enough for this family, no matter what I accomplished or how hard I tried to earn their love and respect. I had spent nearly 2 decades trying to prove my worth to people who had decided from the beginning that I wasn't worth their investment. The realization was both devastating and liberating because it finally freed me from the exhausting cycle of seeking approval from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I made a decision that night that would change the trajectory of my entire life. I would stop expecting anything from Patricia, Jake, or even my father, and instead focus entirely on building my own success and happiness. I applied for graduate school loans, found additional part-time work to cover application fees, and began the process of emotionally detaching from a family that had never really accepted me as one of their own. What I didn't know then was that this decision to prioritize my own well-being would eventually put me in a position of power that Patricia could never have anticipated, and that her years of treating me as disposable would come back to haunt her in ways she never could have imagined. Graduate school transformed me in ways I never could have anticipated when I first walked onto campus with my second-hand laptop and determination to prove myself worthy of success. The MBA program at University of Colorado Boulder was intensely competitive, filled with brilliant minds from privileged backgrounds who discussed family businesses and trust funds as casually as I talked about student loan payments. But adversity had taught me resilience that money couldn't buy, and I approached every assignment, every networking event, and every internship opportunity with the hunger of someone who knew that failure meant having nowhere to fall back on. My professors took notice of my work ethic and innovative thinking, particularly in my strategic management courses, where I seemed to have an intuitive understanding of organizational dynamics and human psychology. Dr. Martinez, my favorite professor, once pulled me aside after a particularly successful presentation and said, "Sarah, you have something special, the ability to see through corporate politics and identify real solutions. That's going to take you far in this world." I threw myself into internships with local tech startups, working unpaid overtime and weekends because I understood that every connection, every skill, and every recommendation letter was an investment in my future independence. During my second year of graduate school, something unexpected happened that would completely alter my family's perception of my worth, though they wouldn't discover it for several more years. One of the startups where I'd been interning, a small company developing environmental monitoring software, was struggling with strategic direction and market positioning. The founder, David Chin, was brilliant with technology, but completely lost when it came to business development and scaling operations. I spent countless hours analyzing their business model, researching market opportunities, and developing comprehensive growth strategies that I presented not as homework assignments, but as genuine solutions to their problems. David was so impressed that he offered me a full-time position with equity compensation, a risk that most of my classmates thought was crazy, but one that made perfect sense to me. "You're betting everything on an unproven company," my study group warned, but I knew something they didn't. When you've grown up with nothing guaranteed, you develop an appetite for calculated risks that others find terrifying. I negotiated a deal that gave me 5% equity in exchange for a below-market salary and the commitment to stay with the company for at least 3 years after graduation. The years following my MBA graduation were a blur of 18-hour workdays, failed product launches, breakthrough innovations, and the gradual transformation of David's small startup into a major player in the environmental technology sector. My psychology background proved invaluable in understanding client needs and building relationships with investors, while my business training helped me navigate the complex world of venture capital and strategic partnerships. We landed our first major contract with a Fortune 500 company during my second year, and suddenly our little software solution was being implemented across industries I'd never dreamed of reaching. The company grew from 5 employees working in David's garage to over 200 people in a sleek downtown Denver office complex. My equity stake, which had seemed like a desperate gamble to my graduate school peers, was now worth more money than I'd ever imagined having. But the most satisfying part wasn't the financial success. It was the knowledge that I'd built something meaningful without any help from Patricia, my father, or anyone else who dismissed my potential. During this period of intense professional growth, my contact with my family dwindled to obligatory holiday phone calls and brief text message exchanges. Patricia would occasionally reach out when she needed someone to watch the house while they traveled or when she wanted to brag about Jake's latest achievements, but these interactions felt increasingly hollow and transactional. My father would sometimes call after a few drinks, usually late at night, expressing vague regrets about not being more involved in my life, but these conversations never led to meaningful change in our relationship. Jake, now in college himself, seemed to exist in a completely separate universe, where his every need was anticipated and met by parents who saw his success as a reflection of their own worth. I found myself caring less and less about their opinions or approval because I was finally building a life that fulfilled me professionally and personally. I'd started dating Marcus, a fellow entrepreneur who'd grown up in foster care and understood the unique challenges of creating your own family when your biological one fails you. Together, we were planning a future based on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation and manipulation. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. While Patricia had spent years trying to make me feel like I didn't belong in their upper-middle-class suburban world, I was now earning more money and wielding more professional influence than my father ever had in his corporate law career. Our company had been featured in Forbes and Incorporated magazine. I'd been invited to speak at major industry conferences, and venture capital firms were regularly trying to recruit me for executive positions with their portfolio companies. But I kept this success largely private, partly because I'd learned to value substance over appearance, and partly because I knew that revealing my financial status would fundamentally change how Patricia and my father treated me. And I wanted their eventual recognition to be based on something more meaningful than money. Marcus often urged me to share news of my achievements with my family, arguing that I deserved their acknowledgement and respect, but I'd learned through painful experience that Patricia's approval was conditional and temporary at best. Instead, I focused on building relationships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. Everything changed on a cold February morning when my phone rang at 6 a.m. with my father's name on the caller ID. His voice was shaky and unfamiliar as he delivered news that would force me to confront my complicated family history in ways I'd never anticipated. "Sarah," he said, his words barely above a whisper, "Patricia's in the hospital. She collapsed yesterday during her yoga class, and the doctors, they've found something serious. Kidney failure, and it's progressing rapidly. We're going to need to discuss treatment options and—" His voice trailed off before he continued with obvious difficulty. "They're going to want to test family members for compatibility as potential donors." The words hung in the air between us as I processed the implications of what he was saying. Patricia, who had spent 15 years making it clear that I wasn't really family, was now facing a medical crisis that might require the ultimate family sacrifice. I felt a complex mixture of emotions: concern for my father's obvious distress, curiosity about whether this crisis might finally break through Patricia's carefully constructed barriers, and a dark sense of poetic justice that the woman who'd rejected me might now need me to save her life. But mostly, I felt a strange sense of calm, as if all those years of emotional preparation for exactly this kind of moment had finally found their purpose. Walking into Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital that February morning felt like entering a parallel universe, where all the family dynamics I'd spent years trying to escape were suddenly inverted and intensified. Patricia looked smaller somehow, diminished in her hospital bed with 4 tubes snaking from her arms and monitors beeping steadily beside her. Her usually immaculate appearance was replaced by the vulnerable reality of serious illness. No makeup, her hair flat against the pillow, her skin pale and drawn. But what struck me most was the desperate hope in her eyes when she saw me enter the room, a look I'd never seen directed at me in all our years of shared history. My father stood beside her bed looking haggard and older than his 58 years, while Jake sat in the corner chair scrolling through his phone with the uncomfortable energy of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Sarah," Patricia whispered, reaching toward me with a trembling hand. "Thank God you came. The doctors say I need a kidney transplant within the next few months, and family members are always the best matches. You're our only hope." The word family hung in the air between us, heavy with 15 years of contradiction and pain, and I found myself studying her face for any sign of recognition about the irony of her current situation. The medical consultation that followed was surreal in its clinical precision and emotional complexity. Dr. Patel, Patricia's nephrologist, explained that her kidney function had deteriorated rapidly due to an autoimmune condition that had been silently progressing for years. Living donor transplants have significantly better outcomes than waiting for a deceased donor, he explained, and genetic compatibility is highest among close relatives. "We'll need to test immediate family members first. That would be her son Jake and stepdaughter Sarah." I watched Patricia's face carefully as the doctor referred to me as her stepdaughter, waiting to see if she would correct him or minimize the relationship as she had done so many times before. Instead, she nodded eagerly and reached for my hand again, saying, "Yes, Sarah's practically like my own daughter. We've always been so close." The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity, and I caught Jake's surprised glance as his mother rewrote decades of family dynamics in a single sentence. My father looked uncomfortable but said nothing, his pattern of avoiding confrontation intact even in this crisis situation. Jake was tested first, and the results came back within 48 hours. He wasn't a compatible donor due to blood type incompatibility. I watched Patricia's face crumble as Dr. Patel delivered the news, and for the first time in my life, I actually felt genuine sympathy for her terror and disappointment. "But Sarah can still be tested," she said quickly, turning to me with desperate eyes. "You'll do the testing, won't you? For family." There was that word again, deployed now as a weapon of emotional manipulation rather than exclusion, but carrying the same calculating energy I'd learned to recognize years ago. I agreed to the testing, not because of Patricia's sudden redefinition of our relationship, but because I needed to understand all my options before making any decisions. The blood draws, tissue typing, and comprehensive medical evaluation took several days, during which Patricia's behavior toward me underwent a complete transformation that would have been comical if it weren't so transparently desperate. She started calling me daily to check on my health, asking about my diet and exercise habits, and even suggesting vitamins I should take to optimize my kidney function. The results came back on a Friday afternoon that would forever divide my life into before and after. I was not just compatible, I was what Dr. Patel called an exceptional match, with tissue compatibility markers that suggested the transplant would have an unusually high success rate. "This is remarkable," he told me during a private consultation. "The genetic markers align almost perfectly. A transplant from you to Patricia would have every advantage possible." As I sat in his office processing this information, I realized that fate had placed me in a position of absolute power over the woman who had spent 15 years trying to diminish my importance in my father's life. Patricia needed something from me that money couldn't buy, influence couldn't secure, and manipulation couldn't obtain. She needed a piece of my body to survive, and I was the only person who could provide it. The irony was so complete it felt almost scripted. the outsider who wasn't real family, had become the most essential family member of all. Patricia's campaign to secure my agreement to donate was masterful in its desperation and transparent in its manipulation. She started sending me handwritten letters, something she'd never done before, filled with memories of my childhood that had been conveniently edited to remove all traces of her coldness and rejection. "I remember how proud I was when you graduated high school," she wrote in one letter, completely ignoring the fact that she'd skipped my graduation ceremony to attend Jake's baseball tournament. She enlisted my father to call me repeatedly with emotional appeals about family loyalty and Patricia's declining health. "She's really changed, Sarah," he would say, his voice heavy with guilt and fear. "This illness has made her realize how much family means to her. She talks about you constantly, about all the things she wishes she'd done differently." Even Jake was recruited for the campaign, reaching out via text messages that were clearly scripted by Patricia. "Hey sis, I know things haven't always been perfect between you and Mom, but she really loves you, and she's really scared. We need you now." The word sis from Jake felt particularly calculated since he hadn't called me that since elementary school. But I had changed too during my years of independence and success, and Patricia's manipulation tactics that had once left me devastated now felt almost pathetically transparent. I scheduled a family meeting at the hospital for a Sunday afternoon when I knew we'd have privacy and uninterrupted time to address the full scope of our family's dysfunction. Patricia, my father, and Jake were waiting expectantly when I arrived, clearly believing that I was coming to announce my decision to donate. Instead, I pulled out a folder of documents and placed it on the hospital table, printouts of emails, text messages, and social media posts that chronicled 15 years of Patricia's systematic exclusion and dismissal of me. "Before we discuss my kidney," I said calmly, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about our family history. These documents show a pattern of behavior that contradicts the narrative you're trying to create now." I watched Patricia's face go pale as I methodically reviewed evidence of her treatment, the family photos I'd been excluded from, the college expenses she'd refused to help with, the countless times she'd made it clear I wasn't real family. My father's hands shook as he recognized emails he'd failed to respond to and phone calls he'd never returned. Jake stared at his phone, unable to meet my eyes as the full scope of his mother's favoritism was laid bare in undeniable detail. "I will donate my kidney to you, Patricia," I said finally, watching relief flood her face before I continued, "but not because we're suddenly family. And not because you've magically developed maternal feelings toward me. I'll donate because I'm capable of compassion even when it hasn't been shown to me, and because my father loves you and would be devastated by your death." Patricia started to interrupt with grateful tears, but I held up my hand and continued. "However, this donation comes with conditions that are non-negotiable. First, you will publicly acknowledge the years of poor treatment and make genuine amends, not just to me but to anyone who witnessed your behavior. Second, you will contribute $50,000 to a scholarship fund I'm establishing for students from broken homes, money that could have helped me but will now help others. Third, you will attend family therapy with all of us to address the dysfunction that created the situation. And finally, if you ever treat me or speak about me the way you have for the past 15 years, I will make sure everyone in your social circle knows exactly who you really are behind your perfect suburban facade." The room was silent except for the steady beep of Patricia's heart monitor as my conditions sank in. My father looked stunned, Jake appeared uncomfortable but not entirely surprised, and Patricia's face cycled through emotions I'd never seen from her: genuine remorse, fear, and something that might have been respect. The transplant surgery took place 3 months later, after Patricia had begun to fulfill her end of our agreement. The therapy sessions were painful but illuminating, forcing long overdue conversations about family dynamics, favoritism, and the impact of years of emotional neglect. Patricia's public acknowledgement of her treatment of me was awkward but genuine, and several family friends privately reached out to apologize for their own complicity in the situation. The scholarship fund received its first contribution, and applications from deserving students began pouring in from across Colorado. As I recovered from surgery in my hospital bed, Marcus beside me holding my hand while Patricia recovered in the room next door, I realized that this experience had given me something I'd never expected. Not Patricia's love or my father's belated attention, but my own sense of completion and power. I had chosen compassion over revenge, generosity over grudges, and in doing so, I had finally freed myself from the need for their approval entirely. 6 months later, when Patricia sent me a handwritten thank you card for my birthday, the first birthday acknowledgement I'd received from her in 15 years, I smiled and filed it away with all the other documents of our complicated family history. But this time, the paper trail told a different story, one of redemption, growth, and the ultimate victory of choosing to be the bigger person even when you hold all the cards.